alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to our center. Today's topic is the future of Muslims in a Trumpian world. A topic that concerns all of us as Muslims, and to be informed and enlightened about this issue, we have a dear and important guest. His name is Dr. Khaled Abou El Fadl. Most of you know him. And let me give a little information about our speaker. Dr. Khaled is the Omar and Esmeralda Elfi Distinguished Professor of Law at the UCLA School of Law, and he is the author of numerous books and the articles on topics in Islam and Islamic law, and books such as The Great Theft, Reasoning with God, Reclaiming Sharia in Modern Age. So, to give his speech, please welcome Dr. Khaled Abou El Fadl.
Assalamu alaikum. Considering the importance of the topic, considering the importance of the topic for our future, all of us, not in a theoretical way, but individually, our future, the future of our children, our well-being, the attendance today confirms a consistent theme, a suspicion that I have, and that is Muslims continue to be largely in a state of slumber as the world spirals on around them. And this is part of what we will talk about today. Before we get into what we can expect from a Trump administration, it's critical that we understand what the individuals who supported and set the foundations for Trump's election represented. There are some who were surprised by Trump's election to the presidency and thought that it was entirely unpredictable. Of course, hindsight is perfect, but beyond hindsight, I've written before Trump was elected and feared this trajectory, this precise trajectory that we are going through right now. And to put it into context, in a nutshell, I see, if you look at Trump's cabinet, or the individuals that Trump has chosen to be a part of his administration, as well as individuals like Khaled Faris, a person with a long established record in Islamophobia, Frank Gaffney, not just a record in Islamophobia, but the author of the anti-Sharia movement, and a very active participant in drafting many of the anti-Sharia bills passed in 30-something states. People like Michael Flynn, who wrote a New York Times bestsellers book, The Right Fight, which I will read from today, and many others. The metamorphosis of many Tea Party activists into, and their absorption into the Trumpian movement, and so on, we witness a cultural and social movement in the United States, a cultural and social movement that has its genesis solidly and clearly in the 90s and even 80s. And I can sum up this cultural, social movement in a very short way, and that is to say, white nationalism. It's the rise and assertion and a reassertion of a white nationalist identity in a very clear and aggressive fashion. We know that since the collapse of the Soviet Union, there has been a theoretical, an abstract, if you will, philosophical search for, well, who is the new enemy? Empires generally, without finding an arch enemy, and this is just simply the history of empires. Empires historically are always searching for the boogeyman, the arch enemy, the theoretical arch enemy that can motivate the existence and the diligence of that empire. And we all know that since the collapse of the Soviet Union, there have been a theoretical, philosophical attempt to argue that some form of Islamism, one form or another, is that new threat, is that new arch enemy. Until Trump, it remained a philosophical movement at the margins of American politics. And even with the election of George Bush II and the coming into politics of ideologues like Rumsfeld and Ashcroft and several people in the Pentagon, there remained a veil of political correctness in simply saying we are in some type of civilizational showdown between us being an ill-defined, rather ambiguous notion of us as representing some type of Western legacy, Western civilization, tradition, Western civilizational heritage, and them who are those who don't represent us, or the antithesis of us, or the arch enemy of us. And even in the Bush administration, although many of the policies of the Bush administration, and the Bush administration gave a boost to Islamophobia in so many ways and in a variety of ways, But the Bush administration still maintained the veneer, at least, of saying we are fighting a strategic war against a strategic opponent, and therefore our war is not necessarily with a whole civilization or a whole culture or a whole religion, and so on. We saw at the Republican convention and the Republican candidates, the debate became much more vulgar, much more stark, where people felt empowered to talk about Muslims as the other in very stark and unapologetic terms, and to perceive as the Muslim, whatever in their mind that Muslim represented, as a threat to the very being and the very integrity of the us. And again, the us being some vague, ambiguous notion of the West. Now, why do I call this a movement of white nationalism? Because if you keep track of the world of intellectual debates and arguments and so on, since the 80s and definitely going into the 90s, there has been a grumbling, a constant theme among the people who later on become critical in the formation of movements like the Tea Party, and then play the critical role in creating the Trumpian momentum, if you will. And that consistent theme is that the liberal adoption, or the adoption of liberal values of pluralism and cultural relativism, the opening up of the West to a dynamic process of social definition, which was a concept quite popular in academic circles, especially. The idea that we are the melting pot of we, the United States, we're the melting pot of the world, and we're proud of it, among a large sway of intellectuals start becoming quite threatening. And it becomes quite threatening in a, whether rational or not, that's beside the point, but a perception that pluralism is diluting our very being, and that the liberal paradigm of open door policies is a threat, is posing a systematic and consistent and persistent threat to what are perceived to be Judeo-Christian values. Now, part of that, some individuals responded to this by saying, well, they're not Judeo-Christian values, they're really Muslim Judeo-Christian values. In other words, to say, well, we Muslims are a part of the value system that exists in the world. And that response in itself was received very bitterly by many of the intellectuals who underpinned the theory of clash of civilizations, like Samuel Huntington and so on. And the basic notion is that even if we are open up to a world of immigrants, as we exist in an increasingly shrinking world, we exist in a world in which communications and technology and scarcity of resources and overpopulation are creating a melting pot of a cosmopolitan reality. And cosmopolitan reality means that all people from wherever they are in the world start looking, sounding the same. They all like the same things, they all eat the same things more or less, they all dress the same way, they all have the same aspirations, they all have the same dreams. Well, you can look at that and you can say, well, that's good, humanity is coming together, or you could look at that and say, wait a minute, if humanity is all going to start looking the same, aspiring for the same, wanting the same, then in what ways am I distinctive? In what ways am I special? And if you are anchored in privilege, especially if you grew up anchored in a sense of privilege and in a sense of entitlement, your response increasingly becomes, well, in what ways am I different? And the white nationalist movement, which has very deep historical roots in the United States, but beyond the United States, that response of in what ways am I different, not only resonated well outside the borders of the United States. We've seen it in Canada, we've seen it in Australia and in New Zealand, even more powerfully than the US. We've seen it in Europe, especially in response to Muslim migration. And ultimately, an idea is like a lost orphan until an intellectual comes around and gives it philosophical legitimacy. And in this case, I mean, the epitome of this legitimating, philosophizing intellectual was in the person of Samuel Huntington and Francis Fukuyama, who basically came in and said, at the right moment, at the time when anxiety among whites was high about, well, who are we, as opposed to everyone else in this cosmopolitan mess that surrounds us. Samuel Huntington and Francis Fukuyama and other less important figures came in and said, well, we are the best. We are the Judeo-Christian civilization, and the Judeo-Christian civilization has its roots in these wonderful values of freedom, equality, democracy, etc., values that are unique and rare to us, and values that, regardless of the cosmopolitan picture that you see around you, don't be deceived. In reality, our civilization, the Judeo-Christian civilization, is unique because these values are inaccessible to others. And that's a very important point, a very critical point in the anchoring and gelling of that outlook. And the outlook could not assert itself in purely racial terms, although if you remember in the 90s there were attempts to make some type of arguments that genetic research shows whites to be endowed with certain features. It was too vulgar for its historical moment, and instead the racial identity became asserted in racial neutral terms. And the way you do that is to describe all the characteristics of a people without naming them in a vulgar way. And so if you read another person who's, if you read triumphalist historians, one of them is a UCLA historian known as Anthony Pagden, who write books about, tell the story of the world. And they say, well, you know, there used to be the Chinese, there used to be the Mongolians, there used to be the Russians, there used to be this, and then the West comes along, and then humanity evolves to a state that it's never attained before, and now the West brought to the world the most evolved and the best values humanity has ever known, and the West triumphed because not of any accidents in history, but because of inherent and fundamental rational causes embedded in the identity and character of the West. And then the Samuel Huntington genre of this says, well, these values are specifically embedded in the Judeo-Christian tradition that evolved in Europe in a certain historical period. So it does not include Eastern Christianity. It does not include, for instance, Greek Orthodox Christianity. It does not necessarily include the Judaism of Eastern lands or Sephardic Judaism. It really is a very particularized view of Judaism and Christianity and Judaism of the West, and as it so happens, the white world. And then once you reach that conclusion, you say, well, these Judeo-Christian values are us, and we must defend them from dilution against the other. Now, and that is precisely the historical moment we're in, is that regardless of what Trump believes in his conscience, if he actually believes any particular thing, what is far more important is the people that he has picked to work with him. And that's far more important and far more critical. And in case you don't know, the way things usually work is that when you pick an attorney general, for instance, or you pick a secretary for Homeland Security or a secretary of state, that individual does not come into office as an isolated person. This person comes into office with their team. So this person comes into office with 100, 200 people, gets rid of the old guard, fires or terminates the contracts of a lot of the people who are already there, replacing them with his or her own people. And policies can either change little or they can change very drastically. And the individuals that Trump is picking look like individuals who would change policies very drastically and very swiftly as well. To give you a taste for especially the Muslim context, one of Trump's team is Michael Flynn, Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, who is will be Trump's advisor on national security. Now, one of the individuals that are part of the paradigm that brought Trump to power have left quite a bit of written record expressing their views. So Michael Flynn, as I said, wrote this book, The Field of Fight. And again, he's Trump's pick for national security, so that this will affect all of our lives. And this book that I'm holding is a New York Times bestseller, and he talks in his book about what is the major fight the West confronts, the most fundamental fight is a fight with what he calls radical Islam. Now, it's not important that you label something radical Islam. What is important is what you say in order to clarify what you have in mind by a label such as radical Islam. Because you or I could be radicals in someone's view, or could be moderate and peacemakers in another person's view. It all depends on how you define your construct or your theme. So he writes in this book the following, and I'm just going to read some passages from it. So notice here he says, radical Islamists represent a failed civilization. Now, normally radical Islamists don't represent any civilization. I mean, radical Islamists represent an aberration or a corruption or a marginality of something. But it will become clear. Listen. Radical Islamists represent a failed civilization. Look at the Muslim world today. It's a spectacular failure. Can anyone remember the last time a scientist, economist, or mathematician in a Muslim country won a Nobel Prize? It did once happen. A Pakistani physicist who trained in Great Britain, the other Muslim laureate, a chemist, spent the bulk of his career in Caltech in the United States. This marks a significant decline in Islamic culture. As the distinguished scholar Martin Kramer rightly says, had there been Nobel Prizes in the year 1000, they would have gone almost exclusively to Muslims. So, now, tracing the Muslim past and saying Muslim present has a serious problem, there's something really wrong with the Muslim present, but then saying that the Muslim present's problem is radical Islam, but at the same time saying, well, what is that problem? Well, it's a failed civilization. It creates an image that that is anchored in paradoxes and not not easily engaged. Here's another passage. Another more fundamental and dramatic effort would be, and this is now he's talking about how to win the war. So he says, another more fundamental and dramatic effort would be call for a complete reformation of the Islamic religion. This must start inside the Muslim community in order to succeed, but it must start somewhere. This need for a religious reformation is more for political purposes than purely religious. Now, right on he continues, radical Islam, so he just finished talking about reforming a complete reformation of the Islamic religion, and just seamlessly shifts to radical Islam as if they're the same phenomenon, right? So it says this need for religious reformation is more for political purposes than purely religious. Radical Islam is a totalitarian political ideology wrapped in the Islamic religion. Why are so many constitutions within the Muslim world based on Sharia, providing for an Islamic regime as an alternative to secular models of governance? Models such as those we have in the West. Then he goes on. The call for religious reformation in the Islamic religion, well, this is the part where he praises Sisi in Egypt, but I'll skip that part. A rather important segment in this book says, the war against radical Islamists must begin at home, where we have declined to challenge their doctrines and expose their many failures. He continues, we can't then win this war by treating radical Islamic terrorists as a handful of crazies and dealing with them as a policing issue, any more than we can win the global war solely with military forces. The political and theological underpinnings of their immoral actions have to be demolished. And notice here, the political and theological underpinnings of their immoral actions have to be demolished. So then, in talking about this war at home, this passage I find fascinating, again, because of its obfuscations and its loss in paradoxes. Says, critics get buried in the details of Sunnah, Hadith, and the Ummah, and the musings of countless Muslim clerics and imams. These so-called Islamic scholars keep their message so complicated so as to create chaos, to confuse in order to control. Bottom line, Sharia is a violent law that is buried in barbaric convictions. It goes on to talk about the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and says no one dares to criticize a prophet, which we should be able to. In a way, we are dealing with the same issues. Muslims want to apply Sharia law by using our own legal system to strengthen what many Americans believe to be a violent religious law that has no place in the United States. Let us not fear what we know to be true. Let us accept what we were founded upon, a Judeo-Christian ideology built on a moral set of rules and laws. Let us not fear, but instead fight those who impose Sharia law and their radical Islamist views. So, what immediately strikes you here is, what precisely do you have in mind when you say radical Islam? Because as the text sounds, at times, and this is quite clear in many of whether John Bannon or even if you read Frank Gaffney, what you all agree upon is that Sharia law is inherently barbaric. What you all agree on is that Muslims want to apply Sharia law, but then their language becomes more discerning and more surgical in saying, well, although the problem is with the Muslim civilization, the problem is with Muslims wanting to apply a barbaric law, but we are in a war to fight radical Islam. And we must respond to this problem of radical Islam with a broad Muslim reformation. The conclusion is rather inescapable that what they have in mind with radical Islam is an ill-defined term that gives them maximum flexibility in responding to political opponents as they arise. So it's not that they have just a bin Laden or just an ISIS or just as Qaeda, which we would all agree are radical and fanatic. But they have in mind anyone that for purely pragmatic reasons might be defined as an enemy. And in this context, we find that in their legal pleadings, whenever there are lawsuits or they're giving interviews to